Hi guys, it's Stephen again, and I'm doing a VR to the Ghost Cob about where I'd like to go back in history. At first, I thought of doing something on the Civil War or uncivil war in America, but I think it's too soon for a non-American to make comments on the Civil War. After all, the last Civil War general died when I was coming up to teenage, or not quite, but I was alive when the last Civil War general died. And that's an amazing thought. The reason I wanted to do it is because I was a Freemason at one time, and the stories of the number of Freemasons who were involved in the Civil War are quite fascinating. At Gettysburg, there were two great friends, Hancock on the Union side and Low Armistead on the rebel side. And I say rebel just because it's easier for me to say than Confederate, the Confederate and all that kind of thing. I make no choice about which side I take. I'd love to have seen that battle and seen how it related to Armistead and Hancock. And I would have loved to see Robert E. Lee, the man who could be a leader of men. And had he been on the other side, things would have been very different. But anyway, I decided to do something on English history. It's a lot safer for an Englishman, when there are so many Americans around. But I want to do something on the Tudor times. You know, it's a fascinating time in English history. It was a time where England had been in turmoil so many times before, and then came the Tudors, and this Prince of Princes, Henry VIII, who gets such a bad press. You know, he had 6 lives. Wives, sorry. Thank you, dear. 2, he executed 2, he divorced 2, and 2 lived. And he's condemned roundly for that. But you've got to think of the times he lived in, that it was desperate that there was some son to follow him, to be a king who could hold the country together. As it was, his son died not long after being made king. He died as a young man. But Henry was beautiful. He was a very handsome man in his younger days. He was very educated. He could compose music. He could dance and show a fine leg. He could joust. And they didn't just let him win. You know, he knew when somebody was being that devious and wouldn't be impressed. He suffered a wound when he fell off his horse during a joust, and it turned into an abscess. And the theory is that he had syphilis, and that's why this abscess wouldn't heal. And he gradually put on weight. He suffered constant pain. The abscess was foul smelling and had to be dressed at least every day, if not more. And he died a Protestant. He but was condemned by today's society. But Elizabeth, his daughter, who he'd once called the bastard, had come to the throne. She'd lived in terror most of her childhood, knowing that her life was under threat every day, especially when Mary was on the throne and the Catholic faith came back. But Elizabeth was loyal to her and tried to keep her head. And eventually Mary died and Elizabeth became queen. She was a young queen, but she was incredibly intelligent. She knew several languages. She, again, like her father, was a great leader, a great ruler. She knew that England needed strength. The problem was she was a woman, and everybody assumed that she would get married, and they were frightened who she would marry. Would she marry one of the Catholic princes? Because she couldn't marry a layman. And there weren't many Protestant princes around that were worth marrying. But she said, no. She said, I'm a virgin, and I will remain a virgin for the whole of my life. And she lived long enough that people accepted that and recognised her strengths, and the country began to settle down. In her younger days, she had men who would follow her to hell and back, men called the Young Turks. They were mainly seamen. There was Drake, Frobisher, Raleigh, and the such. And their hobby, their joy, was to go sailing off to the South Americas and to capture the big gold galleons, the Spanish and French galleons, but mainly Spanish. And they would just take the gold, say thank you very much, and back home to England to put it in the treasury and to keep some of it as a gift from the Queen. And that really made the rest of the world mad, but England ruled the waves for many years after that. Elizabeth was a great leader. She had a way of words, and there was this speech that she made, and I'm going to make a mess of it, but she said, I may have the body and heart of a feeble woman, but I have the stomach of a king, and a king of England at that. An incredible thing to say, because if you had the stomach, you had the stomach to fight. It was sort of a, he had the stomach, which meant that they were prepared to fight, they were able to fight, and by God, you looked out and took care. So her men were loyal to her. They loved her. She was the Virgin Queen. She was even called Gloriana. She had the ability to choose loyal counsellors. One of her main counsellors was Henry Cecil. But the one I want to talk about is Walsingham, her spy master. He'd fled to the continent. He'd gone to Switzerland and to France. Whilst he was in France, there was the Bartholomew massacre. It was when the Catholics rose up and massacred thousands and thousands of Huguenots who didn't share the Catholic faith. They massacred men, women, children, young and old. So violent and nasty was the Bartholomew Day massacre that the River Seine was full of bodies, and so full of blood was it that it ran red. Walsingham saw this, and it frightened him. he was sad and hurt and saw how terrible things were done. Even children were made to watch their parents killed, and then they themselves were killed, or the other way round. Anything to be cruel. When Walsingham came back to England, a staunch Protestant, Cecil recognised something in him that England needed, and he appointed him. He made sure that Walsingham was appointed to the Queen's Council. Now Cecil had 55 spies, which was quite a good number, but Walsingham took those over, and he had a code master, did Walsingham, a man who was so skilled at breaking codes, at opening envelopes and documents, and resealing them, that no one would know that they'd been read and copied. He was skilled at words and ciphers, and there wasn't a code that he didn't seem to be able to not to read. He would have been lauded today by the secret services. But he was Walsingham's man. And Walsingham was the type of man who was loyal to the Queen. She trusted him implicitly. This man would not let her down, and she knew that. He wouldn't be easy, because he had a strong mind, but he had the ability to turn people to him. And there was a college in Rome called the English College where Catholic priests were trained. And at the time they were sent to England, they knew that their life was going to be short, sometimes only a matter of days, before they would be dragged on a hurdle to the place of execution. That was the drawn part of hung, drawn and quartered. There was another aspect of the drawn, which I will go to. When they were executed, they were drawn on the hurdle through the crowds. They would be stripped at the point of execution, a rope would be put round their neck, and they would be hoisted up and immediately let down again. So that was not really doing any good to them at all. And then they would be disembowelled at the drawing of the entrails and burnt in front of them. And whilst they were still alive, their penis and genitals would be cut off and placed in their mouths. And then their heart would be torn out and they would eventually die. And then their body would be cut into pieces. Their heads would be removed and they were put on the gates of London. They were boiled in tar first, just to preserve them longer. Their upper quarters and their lower quarters were sent round to different cities in the country, and one of those quarters would be put on the gates of the chosen city. So it was a terrible time. And there came a Catholic priest called Gilbert. He was caught immediately he landed and taken to Walsingham. And Walsingham managed to turn him to the English side. And they developed a plan whereby Gilbert would go to the Queen, the Mary Queen of Scots, become her personal chaplain, or very close to her, and he arranged that any communications would be sent in secret, supposedly, but they were immediately received by Walsingham. His spy master would carefully open them, would break the ciphers, and would copy the document. and then it would be sealed and sent on to France or Spain, and read and believed that nothing had happened. And documents would also be sent to her followers in England. One of them, a young foolish man, persuaded her that he could lead an uprising and that the Catholics were ready to rise up. He met with a rebel priest, a priest who unusually was in favour of an uprising. Most of the priests were there to look after the spiritual needs of the Catholics, but this man wasn't. And he broke the seal of the confessional by telling this young man certain things that he'd learned. But Walsingham's spies overheard him, and the plot was known, and it was broken apart. And the majority of Catholics did not want to follow and rebel. Walsingham grew in age and years and became disabled with an arthritic disease. He still had a mind as sharp as anything, and his spy group had grown into the hundreds, if not thousands, and were around the world. One even lived in the French embassy in London. Walsingham spies broke the Spanish Armada's codes, so they knew when the Armada was coming. And the English seamen, led by Drake, overcame the Armada. But the main thing that overcame the Armada was a massive storm. Their boats were scattered. They were picked off. They sank. They suffered greatly. And Walsingham was hailed as one of the greatest of men who helped cause this thing. I'm nearly finished, so you'll be glad of that. But as Walsingham was dying, he realised that he needed someone to follow him and chose his son to take his place. But all through his role as spymaster, he never received a penny from the state for his expenses. He made himself a poor man by paying spies, by running the spy ring. And so loyal was he that he never complained once. He had broken the rebellion for Mary Queen of Scots and presented the Queen with the evidence. She wanted to try and find a way to forgive Mary, to pardon her, but the council suggested that she signed the death warrant for the execution. Elizabeth did so, believing that it would be held and not used, but held as a threat over Mary. Walsingham and Cecil took the document, and Walsingham shooed the people concerned and said, "Get on with it." And the Queen was executed. It meant that Walsingham and Cecil had to face Elizabeth and tell her what they'd done. Elizabeth wasn't best pleased, and she had an anger and a firmness about her that they knew she could have them executed. Cecil went and left and went to his holdings and his stately home in the north of England. Walsingham didn't. He stayed and worked on, and eventually Elizabeth forgave him And when he died, the whole country was sad. So much so that the French ambassador in England wrote to it was the Spanish ambassador, wrote to the King of Spain and said, "My Lord Walsingham has died yesterday, expired. The whole city, the whole country is saddened and in mourning." And the King of Spain wrote back, "They may be in mourning in England, but in Spain we are relieved." Such was the power of the man. And I'm going to stop there because I've gone on too long as usual. But I'll stop with maybe a silly little joke. There was a lady on a bus, and this man was berating her for the ugliness of her child, saying that the child should never be brought out in public, that it was an ugly little brat. And she, of course, broke down in tears, and the bus conductor came down and saw her in tears and said, "What on earth's the matter, my dear? You know what's happened? And that man over there has been saying how ugly my child is." And the bus conductor said, "Oh, that's terrible. I'll hold your monkey and you go and hit him."